there, this is Ed Adler, financial consultant, talking about reviving U.S. manufacturing from a financial perspective. Once again, I'm known as Macro Ed. Macro, a series of commands in Excel that reduces repetitive tasks and performs incisive cost analysis and capital expenditures. Now, we're discussing right now the origins of manufacturing retrenchment in our country. The last time we talked about FOCs, family-owned companies, and how they were decimated by xenophobia, Xenophobia, fear of the outsider. Today, we're going to talk about the price of oil and how it created an economic recession, stagflation, and so forth, and how it had a pernicious effect on manufacturing. So the tide is in, and let's get going. But first, before we get into today's stage, we have to date back to 1956, when then President Dwight David Eisenhower instituted the Interstate Highway System. Now, this was a network of highways in the continental United States comprising 42,000 miles of road strategically located to take industry out of the cities and make sure people drove cars to work instead of taking mass transit. But it caused problems for manufacturing. A case in point, the Cross Bronx Expressway in New York City. It not only, when built, drove out manufacturing, drove out middle-class families. Interstate Highway 280 in New Jersey, cutting through East Orange, destroyed an affluent area of East Orange, drove out manufacturing too. And indirectly, Highway 29 in Trenton, connecting to Interstate Highway 295, rerouted, so it drove out light manufacturing, office shops, and so forth. However, there is a happy ending with that. And what happened, the highway is now being rerouted to its original location and direction, so it will create abilities for light manufacturing, office, shops, and restaurants, and of course access to the Delaware River. So that was number one. But number two was mass transit. Now again, we have to date back to 1956, when then the private rail operators pleaded, according to Public Broadcasting System Special on Frontline, pleaded with then President Eisenhower for funding. Unfortunately, President Eisenhower slammed the door in their faces. As a result, commuter railroads were abandoned, trolley tracks were demolished, private rail operators just departed the scene. Bus stations fell into a state of disrepair, being places of crime and seediness, blight. Mass transit was primarily relegated for lower-class people. The third problem, and this is a little sensitive, but we have to talk about it, is the Black or African-American migration from the South to the cities of the Northeast and Midwest. Some people refer to this as the Great Migration. I refer to it as the tragic migration because, as we know, blacks or African Americans were treated terribly by the white majority in the South and were looking for work wherever they could find it. But the problem was that all these cities in the Northeast and Midwest couldn't handle this migration, coupled with racism, poverty, illiteracy, crime, broken families, illegitimate children, over a relatively short period of time. Case in point, the Polo Grounds, where then the New York baseball Giants played before unfortunately moving to San Francisco. In 1951, in Upper Manhattan, the area was comprised of 1/3 Irish, 1/3 Italian, 1/3 Jewish, with a smattering of Greek, Polish, Armenian, Hungarian. Only 5 years later, in 1956, the area was 97% black or African American. As a result, we had this white flight from cities, large, medium, small, throughout the Northeast and Midwest. This creates additional suburban sprawl. This creates additional demand for oil. And this creates higher inflation and compounds costs for domestic manufacturing. It's a reduction that comes to that. And what hurts even more, it serves in a way as a tax. As the Wall Street Journal said, a decline in oil prices is equivalent to a tax cut, and an increase in oil prices is equivalent to a tax hike. And what made matters even worse, that most of the automobiles at that time posted low mileage per gallon. They're known as gas guzzlers. The bigger the car, the better. The greater the status symbol. And what made matters even worse now is large corporations followed. They didn't move nearby a major city or a downtown with rail transportation. They moved 20, 30, 40 miles out to affluent suburbs. The only means of getting there was the automobile. And these automobiles were gas guzzlers, therefore compounding the costs of manufacturing. And what made matters even worse is a lot of these companies did not embrace the computer at that time, late 60s, early 70s, and so forth. And they operated upon the underlying assumption that each person with average skills would contribute a little bit to the right answer, when in reality, most of the time, each of these people contributed to the wrong answer. As a result, these people needed to be trained. And what happened? Every Friday from April through October, with the exception of Memorial Day weekend, Independence Day, July 4th weekend, and Labor Day weekend, training sessions would occur every Friday. And there would be substantial gridlock, both in morning and evening rush hours on our interstate highways. As a result, increased oil demand, driving up the price of oil. And what made matters worse is BP, British Petroleum, ran a commercial that once said, America uses more products with oil in it than any other country in the world. That's not something to be proud of. That's something to be apprehensive of. And what makes matters even worse is the Rand Corporation pointed out, venerable think tank in Santa Monica, California, that companies that locate in our cities or downtown where there's rail transportation create many more jobs than they do out in a rural area or an affluent suburb. Case in point, small manufacturing company in New Jersey could have located out on Interstate Highway 295 in South Jersey, but instead chose to locate between Camden and Trenton on the River Line. Yeah, between Camden and Trenton. Small town. Very white middle class, but it created at least 180 more private sector jobs by being located and reduced the costs of manufacturing by reducing people using mass transit. What happens as a final result, US manufacturing from 1969 to the middle 1980s, it gets slammed with a double whammy. The first, as I've mentioned, the high cost of oil created enormous costs of manufacturing and so forth. And it drove manufacturing out. But it wasn't just that. It was also that it reduced the number of markets, private markets, and access to these markets that companies had. So that now companies are all spread out. How can other companies sell their products when people are all spread out over the world and not being more centralized? But there is some light at the end of the tunnel. A company called Amazon is locating in New York City, in Virginia, which is actually Washington, D.C., and partially in Nashville, Tennessee. It's going to be centralized. One, there are going to be a lot of people there that can sell their products to, and two, there's tremendous access. Buses, trains, subways, trolleys, all kinds of mass transit to each. This will increase the markets and access to markets that companies can sell their products. But getting back to what happened, U.S. manufacturing companies unfortunately evaded this cost overrun and ran away. They reduced their production capacity somewhat of the surviving production facilities. They moved some plants, although smaller, down south. They moved some facilities to Latin America. They outsourced, but at a smaller, lower level, to outside contractors and lacked financial controls. And they shut down some production facilities entirely. So now we have one, the family-owned companies, FOCs, that were decimated. Two, we have oil that increased the cost of manufacturing and had a very pernicious, harmful effect on manufacturing. Next time, we'll talk about the Japanese invasion. Not so much about automobiles. We'll take care of that in another episode. But we'll talk about it in general, particularly with a little emphasis on electronics. So the tide is out, and it's time for Macro Ed to ride out into the sunset. Catch you at the next high tide.